My name is Margaret Ellison. I'm 68 years old. Before I retired, I worked as a senior accountant for a real estate company. Back then, people respected you for your work, for your word. They shook your hand, looked you in the eye, and meant it. Those days feel far away now. These days, I live alone in the house my late husband Charles left me. We built a quiet, steady life together and raised one son, Daniel. He was my reason for everything, and for most of my life, I believed I was his. That was before the wedding I never attended, before the message I should never have heard, before I realized my only son was planning my disappearance like I was a problem to be solved. It happened on an ordinary Thursday. I was at the kitchen counter peeling apples for a pie I'd promised Daniel. He always liked mine. Cinnamon, never too sweet, the way his father liked them too. My phone buzzed. It was a voicemail from Daniel, though we'd already spoken that morning. I wiped my hand on my apron, thumb still dusted with flour, and pressed play. She's still here. God, I can't stand that old hag. Once she's gone, the estate is ours. 7.8 million. Paris, here we come. The voice was his, clear, cold, and then laughter. His wife's voice joining in, sharp and gleeful. I stood there, still as stone. My hands didn't tremble, my legs didn't falter, but inside me something caved in. I hit replay. I needed to be sure, and there it was again. My son's voice, plodding, laughing, careless. I had been the one who paid their rent when jobs slipped through their fingers, who bought them their first car, who covered medical bills they couldn't afford, who handed over checks when their businesses failed one after the other. I had done it all with love, never once keeping score, and yet here they were, mocking me, reducing my life and sacrifices to an obstacle between them and Paris. The cinnamon on the stove scorched and filled the kitchen with bitter smoke. I didn't move to stop it. Instead, I walked into the dining room. On the sideboard was a framed photo of Charles, his fishing hat tilted, that grin of his, warm and lopsided. Daniel used to look so much like him, but now he sounded like a stranger I'd never trust at my door. I sat at the table, pressing my palms flat against the wood, tracing the familiar grooves. This table had been the heart of our home. Christmas mornings, birthday cakes, college acceptance letters, quiet tears over a cancer diagnosis. Today it heard something different. My voice, calm and steady, leaving a message for my attorney. Execute the trust transfer immediately. I had planned for this years ago, though I never imagined I'd use it against my own child. But I was of sound mind, sharper than they thought, and that meant I still had the power to act. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay awake, the room dark except for the restless wind outside tugging at the maple tree in the yard. The same tree that had once lulled baby Daniel to sleep in my arms when I rocked him by the window. I listened to that voicemail replaying in my head. His voice, her laughter, the way she said Paris, like it was a prize for waiting out my life. The cruelest cut wasn't her laughter. It was his silence. The silence of a son who no longer saw me as his mother, but as a ledger to be closed. I wasn't Margaret anymore. I was an account balance with gray hair, a delay between them and their trip to Paris. When the sun broke through, I rose, boiled water, and poured it into the same teacup I'd used every morning since Charles passed. And for the first time in a long while, I knew exactly what I had to do. It was a gift from our 35th anniversary. Porcelain, hand-painted, the rim chipped just enough to catch the light when I lifted it. I traced that crack with my thumb and whispered into the quiet, "I'm not gone yet," though they already speak as if I were. That was the truth of it. My presence had become an inconvenience, a pause between them and the life they wanted. But I was finished being the pause. I sipped from the cup, and with that, the trust clause I'd put in place long ago came alive. Everything Charles had worked for, property, investments, the retirement savings I had never touched, was now secured in a way no one could reach without me. That message from Daniel hadn't just been betrayal. It had been a warning, and I heard it. This house wasn't always filled with silence. Once it carried laughter. It was never just wood and nails. It breathed with life, memory, warmth. I still remember the day Daniel was born. The rain was pounding against the hospital windows, steady and heavy, like 1,000 tiny fists. I was 29, nervous and hopeful, holding a pair of booties I'd knitted months before. When the nurse placed him in my arms, I whispered, "Welcome home." He became my home, and I became his. When Charles died 12 years later, a sudden aneurysm on an ordinary Tuesday morning, I didn't let grief consume me. I couldn't. Daniel needed me. He needed rides to school, someone to clap too loudly at his band concerts, someone to make breakfast no matter how tired I was. I became everything. Mother, father, nurse, cheerleader, protector. We had so little then. I scrubbed office floors at night and worked the church pantry on weekends, bringing home dented cans and expired cereal. I remember one month in particular, Daniel needed $260 for a school trip. I skipped meals for 2 weeks. Living on hot water I pretended was tea. I never told him. He never knew. That was how I wanted it. Then Rebecca came along. She showed up one spring afternoon with a lemon cake she'd baked, her hands trembling as she set it on the table. Daniel's eyes lit up. She was kind in those days. She called me Mama E with a shy smile, asked about Charles, about my flowers, about the quilt in the hallway. We'd sit on the porch together drinking tea. The good tea, the one I kept in the blue tin with gold trim, always poured into my mother-in-law's porcelain cup. I never let anyone use that cup, not even Daniel, until Rebecca. She traced the painted flowers with her finger once and said, "It looks like it carries stories." I nodded, then set it before her. "It does," I told her, "and today it carries lemon tea." That cup became a ritual, the three of us sharing quiet moments around it. We weren't wealthy, but we had care. That was our wealth. Homemade soup on cold nights, turning off the radio so they could nap, listening to their dreams spill across the dinner table. I remember the first time Daniel lost his job after college. He sat outside for hours, hollow, staring past the yard. Rebecca hovered behind him, wringing her hands. I brought out sweet potato pie, his favorite, and poured tea into that porcelain cup. "Tomorrow you'll start again," I said, handing it to him. "But tonight we rest." He looked at me as if I'd steadied him when the ground gave way. Years went on. They stayed here longer than planned, first saving for an apartment, then moving back when the apartment didn't work out. Then the baby came, and the house stretched its old arms wider to hold them. I let it. I wanted them to feel safe here, not just sheltered but carried, the way this house had always carried us. I patched the floorboards myself when they creaked, replanted the garden after the dog tore through my tulips, and covered the heating bill when their account slipped into the red. Each time I told myself, this is what mothers do. We carry the weight so our children can stand taller. But lately the echoes in this house have changed. The laughter has gone quiet. So has the warmth. Rebecca no longer drinks tea from the porcelain cup. It sits untouched in the cabinet, gathering dust. She passes it now without a glance, as if it doesn't exist, as if I don't exist. She doesn't call me Mama E anymore. She calls me Margaret. Just Margaret. And Daniel, my Daniel, barely looks up from his phone when I walk into the room. He once kissed my cheek every morning. Now I can't remember the last time we spoke without tension braided through every word. Last night, I set the table for 3, the way I always have. But they came home late, said they'd already eaten out, and the plates I laid out stayed empty. I sat there anyway, sipping tea from the cup that once meant something, listening to the tick of the clock, sharp and steady, keeping time for all the music that's no longer played in this house. Sometimes I wonder when I stopped being their home. I had just pulled a tray of cookies from the oven when the phone buzzed. The scent of vanilla and cinnamon wrapped through the kitchen, the same scent Daniel adored when he was a boy. I'd spent the morning baking, sugar cookies, lemon crinkles, and those peanut butter ones with the chocolate kiss in the center. Rebecca once told me they reminded her of her childhood. I thought it would be a sweet surprise for them. I wiped my hands on my apron and answered, smiling. "Hi, sweetheart." There was a pause, then Rebecca's voice, light and casual, as if she were commenting on the weather. "Oh, hi, Margaret. Just calling to let you know we got married yesterday." My heart stuttered. What? "Yeah, it was small," she went on. "Just our closest circle, very intimate. We only invited special people." That word, special, hung in the air, sour and heavy. My eyes drifted toward the hallway where my pale blue dress still hung, freshly cleaned. The shoes I had set by the door were waiting. "I see," I managed. Rebecca's voice carried on, bright and unbothered. She told me about the vows in the garden, her sister singing, the release of white doves. She spoke as though I were a distant acquaintance, not the woman who raised her husband, not the woman who had already paid for most of the wedding she was describing. "I'm sure Daniel looked handsome," I said softly. "He did," she replied. I could hear his laughter in the background. Carefree, unbothered. I looked down at the tin of cookies in my hands, still warm from the oven. I had planned to surprise them, maybe bring along the photo album with Daniel's baby pictures. There was one of him in a little tuxedo at 5 years old, marrying his teddy bear in the living room. I thought it might make them laugh. Instead, I stood in my kitchen with nothing but sugar cookies and silence. My heart didn't break with a sharp snap. It folded inward, slow and deliberate like paper creasing beneath a steady hand. I carried the tin to the dining table and set it down. The sound of metal meeting wood seemed loud in the stillness. I sat and waited, for words that never came. Words like "we wish you had been there" or "we missed you." Instead, Rebecca's voice softened. "Anyway, we'll stop by next week to pick up the rest of the check for the decorator." Of course, that was what they remembered. Not me. Not my dress hanging in the hallway. Not the hours I spent baking cookies. The money, always the money. I closed my eyes and whispered, "Of course." She cried when the manager told her the dates were nearly gone. I didn't hesitate. I made the calls. I broke a certificate of deposit early. I sold Charles's coin collection, the one he'd started as a boy. I paid it all quietly, the way mothers do, so their children never feel the weight. And now I wasn't even worth a folding chair in the back row. "Margaret, you still there?" Rebecca's voice came through the line. "Yes," I said. "Okay. Just wanted to let you know. Thanks again for everything. It all turned out perfect." I wanted to ask if she had noticed the empty chair I might have sat in, if Daniel had hesitated, even for a heartbeat, when he spoke his vows without me there, but I didn't ask. I only whispered, "Congratulations," and ended the call. The dial tone hummed in my ear, sharp and unrelenting. I leaned back into my chair and let the weight of it press into me. The dress still hung in the hallway, untouched. The cookies cooled on the counter, and I had never felt more invisible. I walked into the living room and lifted the porcelain teacup from the shelf, the one passed down from my mother-in-law. I could still hear her words. Being a mother means holding your breath forever and still smiling. I traced the fine cracks along its rim and whispered, "I wasn't special. I was just a checkbook, a shadow, a placeholder until the lights came on. I baked, I paid, I gave, and what I received was silence. And in that silence, I finally understood. They hadn't forgotten me. They had chosen to erase me." The next morning, the house felt hollow, like a shell pressed against an ear. I shuffled into the kitchen, slippers brushing against the worn wood floor. My hands moved from habit. Fill the kettle, set the cups. One for me, one for whoever used to sit here and laugh with me over burnt toast or leftover pie. Steam rose slow and soft from the kettle. I placed 2 porcelain cups with little violets on the table, added spoons, poured the tea. Then I froze. What was I doing? No one was coming. No one would sit across from me anymore. I stared at the second cup, heavy with meaning, meant for love, for company. My hands were warm from the kettle, but something inside me turned cold. Slowly, I lifted the second cup, poured the tea back into the pot, and turned it upside down on its saucer. 1 cup was enough. It had to be. I sat, holding the porcelain between my palms as though its heat might soften the ache spreading in my chest. It didn't. Out of habit, I reached for my phone. And there it was, Rebecca's post. Bright and polished, joy painted across a screen. A wedding photo. She stood in lace, the very dress I had paid for. I recognized the hem I'd covered, the neckline we altered twice until she smiled at her reflection and whispered, "This is the one, Mama E." My throat tightened. She looked beautiful, glowing in a vineyard upstate. The caption read, "Married the love of my life yesterday." Private, intimate, perfect. Her parents were in the photo, seated proudly beside her. Her mother in a navy gown, her father raising a glass. They looked content, like family should. I wasn't in the picture, not even blurred in the background. I had paid for the dress, the deposit, the catering. I remembered signing the checks, believing I wasn't just giving money but a part of myself. A piece of my heart stitched into every lace seam, but I hadn't been deemed special enough to be there. I swiped to the next post, a clip of their first dance. Margaret Ellison sat in the kitchen, her hands folded around a porcelain teacup, the kind her late husband Charles had once brought back from a trip. The house was quiet, too quiet for a morning that should have been filled with family. A clock ticked above the doorway, and in its rhythm, she felt the ache of absence. She had baked 2 days earlier, shortbread cookies the way Daniel liked them, golden at the edges, soft at the center. They sat in a tin on the counter, tied with a bow she'd picked out at the drugstore. She had meant to give them to Rebecca before what she thought was a pre-wedding trip, a cheerful send-off before the real celebration. But that day had been the wedding. They hadn't said goodbye, just kissed her on the cheek, said they had errands, and left smiling. Margaret's gaze fell on the pale lavender dress still hanging in the living room. She had taken it to the dry cleaner, pressed and ready, because some part of her believed there might still be a call, a last-minute invitation, a chance to belong. She walked over and brushed the silk with her hand. It felt like reaching for something already gone. The silence in the house wasn't gentle. It had an edge, as if to say, "You aren't needed anymore." She turned back toward the kitchen, sunlight spilling across the table in gold stripes. She looked at the empty chair across from hers and felt the truth settle in. She wasn't family that day. She was funding, not part of their future, just a leftover piece of their past. Her phone buzzed. Rebecca's post lit up the screen. A vineyard wedding, vows exchanged beneath twinkling lights, her parents smiling at the front row. Daniel looked happy, whole. He wasn't searching for her in the crowd. He wasn't missing her at all. Margaret's throat tightened. She had paid for that lace dress, had written the check for the catering deposit, had covered costs so quietly that no one thought twice about what it meant. And yet, when the pictures were taken, she wasn't in them. She didn't cry, not that morning nor the next. Instead, she walked to the printer and pulled out a folder she had labeled but never opened. Daniel and Rebecca expenses. 3 years of records. She slid in fresh paper and began printing. Receipts, invoices, bank transfers, utilities, rent when they fell short, Rebecca's therapy bills after the accident, Daniel's insurance premiums during the months between jobs, the down payment for their hybrid SUV, the catering deposit for a wedding she never saw. Page after page slid out, warm to the touch, and Margaret stacked them neatly on the table beside the calculator. Her fingers pressed the keys, each total a reminder. $284,672. That was the cost of being invisible. And yet she didn't regret the money. Not entirely. Because when you're a mother, you don't see dollars. You see your son's voice breaking over the phone at midnight when the mortgage fails. You see Rebecca in tears because the dress won't zip after surgery. You see an empty fridge, a car without working brakes, the kind of problems that could break young people in half. So you fix them, quietly, without asking, without expecting to be paid back. Margaret sat in the silence with the stack of papers in front of her. For the first time in years, she wasn't just Daniel's safety net, or Rebecca's quiet helper. She was a woman alone in her kitchen, staring at proof of what it had taken to love without condition, and the price of being forgotten. Margaret Ellison used to tell herself, if I can help, I should. But staring at the total on her calculator, more than $250,000, another thought came. And if they never thank you, if they build a life without you, if they take your giving and still decide you're not worth a place at their table. She sat down at the kitchen table and, for the first time, wrote the truth. Not about the money, but about what it had cost her. It cost her roast dinners she skipped for months so Daniel and Rebecca's pantry would stay full. It cost her the new glasses she never bought, the trip to Arizona she postponed every year. It cost her the pride she swallowed when Rebecca rolled her eyes at her not understanding influencer talk, or when Daniel sighed, "Mom, you wouldn't get it." But it wasn't just dollars. It was value. It was her place in their lives. Margaret turned to a different folder, one she hadn't opened in over 10 years. Inside was the trust her late husband Charles had set up before he passed. The first line was simple. Upon the death of the grantor, the trust shall pass to Margaret Ellison in full, including all real estate, business assets, and investments totaling $7.8 million. She read it twice, then again. After years of pouring herself out, she had almost forgotten. She wasn't just a background figure in other people's story. She had once been the center of Charles's world, a man who trusted her, honored her, and built a life with her, not around her. And Daniel didn't know about the clause that followed. Any further distribution shall be left to the discretion of the trustee, Margaret Ellison, with a stipulation that distributions are contingent upon active, respectful participation in the family unit. Vague, yes, but binding. The realization spread through her slowly, like morning light. Her silence all these years hadn't been weakness. It had been faith. Faith that they would remember who she was. Faith that love could be repaid in kind. But now she saw the truth, sharp and bitter. She wasn't being pushed aside because she gave too little. She was being discarded because she had given too much. And like anything handed over without limit, time, trust, tenderness, they assumed it would never run out. But trust, even the legal kind, comes with terms. Margaret folded the documents carefully, pressing the edges flat with her thumb. Some part of her still wanted to believe Daniel was simply blind, not cruel. That Rebecca's voice had drowned out his own. That maybe he didn't understand what he was choosing when he turned away. But the wedding wasn't an accident. It was a statement, and so was her next step. She picked up the phone and called her attorney. "Hello, Meredith. It's Margaret Ellison. I think it's time we reviewed the distribution terms of the Ellison Trust. No rush, but set aside some time this week. I'll be bringing a stack of records with me." If they had treated her as just a bank account, then she would handle this as a transaction, and this time, the terms would be hers. She pulled on her navy cardigan, the one Charles used to say made her look like a woman with both a plan and a backup. She wasn't sure if she had either when she slid into the car, but she knew exactly where she was going. Just off Sycamore Lane sat a cottage wrapped in ivy, where her oldest friend, Mabel Given, still lived. They hadn't spoken in too long. Grief and years had built walls, but Mabel had always been her person. Margaret carried the tin of shortbread as an offering. When Mabel opened the door in her slippers, her mouth curved into a wry smile. Well, well, the prodigal widow returns. I come bearing cookies, Margaret replied. Then all is forgiven, Mabel said, ushering her in. Chamomile tea steeped in the good china cups as they sat by the bay window, listening to rain patter softly against the glass. For the first time in a long while, Margaret felt something loosen in her chest. She hadn't lost everything. Not yet. Margaret Ellison slid her phone across Mabel's kitchen table. Play the message, she said softly. Mabel raised an eyebrow, tapped the screen, and listened. Her face stayed still for a moment, then her jaw tightened. She shut her eyes as the words spilled out. I can't stand this old woman anymore. Soon she'll be gone, and we'll be spending her money in Paris. Mabel let out a slow breath. I thought Rebecca loved him, she murmured. I thought she saw the man you raised. She does love him, Margaret answered quietly, but not the version I raised. She loves the man who's learned how to turn someone else's kindness into currency. There was no need for Mabel to argue. Margaret told her everything. How Daniel and Rebecca had slipped away and married without her. How they had smiled with practiced ease. How her son looked away when she asked about the wedding. And then she told her what she had done the night before. She pushed a thick folder across the table. Mabel flipped through the pages. Receipts, statements, highlighted totals. Margaret's hands had trembled as she compiled them. $76,000 for their down payment. $22,400 for Rebecca's mother's medical bills. $3,500 for the dress deposit. $39,000 for a car. $11,000 in insurance premiums. $98,000 for the house renovation and garden wall. Dozens of smaller expenses, too many to count. Altogether, $284,700 in just 3 years. Mabel's lips pressed into a line of disbelief and anger. I needed to prove to myself I wasn't being petty, Margaret whispered, that maybe this ache could be measured, that it had arithmetic. You don't need math to justify betrayal, Mabel said firmly. Maybe, but the numbers don't lie. My love became a ledger, Lyons fell. Only the tick of the mantel clock and the soft hiss of rain outside filled the room. Then Mabel said the one thing Margaret hadn't dared to hope for. We're going to fix this. Margaret blinked. How? You said Charles left a family trust, right? Yes. He set it up before he passed, for me and Daniel. I thought it was secure. I remember Charles. He wasn't careless. Did you ever finalize the successor trustee documents? Margaret hesitated. They're in my drawer. I never sent in the updated forms after he passed. A spark lit Mabel's eyes, the same one Margaret remembered from their days in law school mock trials. Then we still have time. You can amend it now. Make it irrevocable. Appoint me as temporary trustee. Transfer full control of everything. Your house, retirement accounts, the portfolio. All of it. Margaret froze. Daniel doesn't know the trust has this clause. Exactly why it will work, Mabel said with a quiet smile. Margaret took a sip of tea. It tasted like air after surfacing from deep water. But he'll find out. Let him, Mabel replied. What's he going to say? That his mother used the trust her husband built to protect herself from being drained dry? For the first time in days, Margaret laughed. A real unguarded laugh. You're sure this isn't vindictive? It's not vindictive, Mabel said gently. It's wise. Margaret looked out the window. The sky was gray, heavy. In the distance, 2 crows chased a hawk across the horizon. Nature didn't wait for fairness. It acted. You'll need to move quickly, Mabel added. Once it's locked down, no one can touch a cent without the trustee's consent. That's you, or me if you'd rather stay quiet. Quiet, Margaret said firmly. Mabel rose. I'll call the notary. You'll need to sign within 48 hours. When she left the room, Margaret traced the rim of her teacup. The woman she had been, the one who waited for apologies, who longed for her son and daughter-in-law to see her worth without a price tag, was gone. What remained was a woman who understood her place in the story, and this time she would write the terms herself. I wasn't plotting revenge. I was reclaiming peace, one choice at a time. The first thing I did that morning was call a locksmith. Not because I felt unsafe, fear had long since left me, but because I needed to draw a quiet line in the sand. A way to tell myself I would no longer leave the doors of my life open to those who had shown me how little they valued being inside. The young man arrived right at 9. He was polite, efficient, and asked no questions beyond what was necessary. As he unscrewed the deadbolt Daniel had once installed, I stared at its dull brass finish. I had paid for it, just as I had paid for the house it secured, the car in the driveway, and the life my son and Rebecca were enjoying without me. When the lock dropped into the technician's box with a soft clink, I felt lighter. That sound was freedom. I had him change every lock, front, back, garage, even the shed. It wasn't about keeping them out. It was about finally acknowledging that they had walked out on me long ago. They had simply forgotten to hand back the keys. After he left, I drove to the bank. The teller greeted me warmly. "Good morning, Mrs. Ellison. What can we do for you today?" "I need to make some changes," I said, sliding over my ID. "I'd like to remove Daniel Ellison from all joint accounts, cancel his authorized access, and update all passwords and verification methods." Her brows lifted slightly, but she nodded. "Would you like to speak with a financial officer about everything?" "Yes, if Ethan is available." Ethan had managed our accounts for years. Soft-spoken, steady, with a kindness that never felt forced. In his office, he carefully reviewed the folder I handed him. "You're revoking everything?" he asked, scanning the documents. "Power of attorney, shared cards, automatic transfers." "Yes," I said firmly. "It's long overdue." He nodded, typed a few things, then pushed a stack of forms toward me. "We can start today. Just needs your signature," I signed. Line after line, pen to paper, I pulled the pieces of my life back into my own hands. When we finished, Ethan organized the papers neatly into a new folder. He hesitated, then met my eyes. "I hope you don't mind me saying this, Mrs. Ellison, but I've seen how much you've done for them these past years. House payments, insurance, medical bills, tuition, even the wedding. You've carried them with grace." I blinked at him, surprised by the warmth in his voice. "But maybe now," he added gently, sliding the folder across the desk, "it's time you carried yourself." His words didn't shatter me or spark tears. They didn't feel like thunder. They were softer, like the first window opened after a long winter, when fresh air slips into a stale room and suddenly you realize you can breathe again. Maybe I hadn't been discarded when Daniel and Rebecca chose to move forward without me. Maybe I'd just gone quiet, like an old radio waiting for someone to tune it back to life. Forgotten, but not broken. I thanked Ethan, tucked the folder under my arm like a compass, and stepped outside. The air felt different. Crisp. Mine again. On the drive home, I passed Lillian's Flowers, the little shop wedged between the bakery and the dry cleaner. I hadn't walked in since before Charles passed, yet without thinking I pulled into the lot. Inside I bought tulips. Not roses, not lilies. Tulips. Bright orange ones that glowed like fire in the sunlight. I didn't need a reason. For once, I was choosing something just for me. I just wanted something bright in the house again. When I came back from town, I placed the tulips in a crystal vase, one of the last wedding gifts Charles and I had received, and set them by the window where the light could catch them. The house was still quiet, but it didn't feel hollow anymore. I brewed myself a cup of tea, opened the window, and sat at the kitchen table with just one cup. Mine. No extra places. No waiting for someone who had already chosen to sit elsewhere. I wasn't finished. I was beginning again, and for the first time in years, I wanted to see where that beginning might take me. The knock came soft and measured, like it had been practiced. When I opened the door, Daniel stood there, Rebecca close by his side, and a man in a slate-colored suit holding a briefcase. My heart knew before my head did. "Hi, Mom," Daniel said, straightening his tie. "Can we come in?" I stepped aside. They walked in as though it were still theirs to enter. Rebecca glanced around the living room, offering a small smile that felt more like politeness than warmth. The man in the suit set his case on the coffee table and opened it, arranging papers with tidy precision. Daniel gestured toward the sofa. "Mom, we've been talking. We just want to make sure everything is in order." Rebecca chimed in, her tone honeyed. "You've seemed a little tired lately. We only want to help." The lawyer finally spoke. "Mrs. Ellison, I'm here on behalf of your son and daughter-in-law. They feel it would be wise to establish certain protections: financial guardianship, medical decisions, access to trust accounts. Nothing binding without your signature, of course." He slid 3 thick documents forward. I didn't reach for them. My eyes stayed on Daniel. "So this is what you came for? You want me to sign it all over?" Daniel spread his hands, not meeting my gaze. "It's not like that, Mom. We just don't want you to worry." Rebecca leaned forward. "Think of it as security. You've always trusted Daniel." My hand brushed the edge of my cardigan. Memories pressed close. The mortgage payments, the tuition checks, the down payment, the wedding deposits. Quiet sacrifices that had filled their lives with ease. And now I was something to be managed. I didn't raise my voice. I simply reached into the drawer by my chair and set a small USB drive on the table. Daniel frowned. "What's that?" "A reminder," I said softly. "From last week." Rebecca's smile faltered. Daniel's voice sharpened. "Mom, what are you talking about?" I met his eyes. "The voicemail you left by accident. The one where you called me a burden. The one where you laughed about spending what was left after I was gone." The color drained from Rebecca's face. She looked at Daniel sharply. He stammered. That was out of context. A stupid joke. You're twisting it." "I haven't twisted anything," I said, calm and clear. "You're the one who gave it meaning." The lawyer shifted uneasily, his pen pausing mid-note. The silence that followed was heavier than any contract. "Mrs. Ellison, if now isn't convenient," the lawyer began. "It isn't," I said, and the word landed like a lid. "And these aren't the right papers, the right excuses, or the right people." I rose slowly, steadier than I had felt in weeks. "Daniel, Rebecca, I am not losing my mind. I remember everything, painfully clear." Rebecca moved to interrupt. Daniel opened his mouth as if to soften things. "You meant every word," I said, voice low but firm. "Now I mean mine." I pushed the folder of forms across the coffee table. They fluttered to the rug like dry leaves. "Too late for this season," I told them. "You can go." Daniel hovered, unsure whether to argue or retreat. Rebecca grabbed his sleeve. "Let's go," she hissed. At the doorway I added, "Daniel, one more thing." He paused. "Your father's trust isn't what you think," I said. "Ask a lawyer. A good one." Then I closed the door with no flourish, only finality. The house felt different afterward. Not empty, exactly, but quieter in a way that let me breathe. I spent the next week reorienting myself, pulling curtains, repotting plants in the sunroom, relearning the small routines that meant I belonged to myself. I began to feel awake again, not a fading matriarch in a painted rocker, but a woman reintroducing herself to her life. Then came the discovery. A tiny blue light winked at the corner of the bedroom molding. At first, I thought it was a reflection, or a stray LED. When I climbed onto the footstool with a mirror, I realized it was a lens, small and deliberate. My stomach dropped. Hands shaking. I unplugged lamps, yanked back curtains, emptied drawers I hadn't opened in weeks. That night I didn't sleep in my bed. I sat in the kitchen with my old flip phone and called a friend of Charles's who knew more about these things than I did. He arrived early the next morning with a small toolkit and a steady voice. Within half an hour, he found 3 hidden cameras, one in the bedroom trim, one lodged in the hallway facing the bathroom, and another tucked in the closet. Each camera pinged to a cloud account tied to an email that traced back to Rebecca. I sat very still, palms flat on my knees, thinking of all the ordinary things I had done for this family. Bandaging scraped knees, sitting through ERs, selling a cherished piano to buy a used car for a young man just starting out. And now someone had watched me in my most private moments. This was beyond betrayal. It was a violation. My friend offered to file a report then and there. I shook my head. Not yet. I needed to think. That afternoon I stepped onto the porch for fresh air and found Mrs. Calderon next door pruning roses. She had a gentle way about her, and eyes that had seen a great deal. "Are you all right, Margaret?" she asked without looking up. I hesitated, then walked over and asked if I could tell her something strange. She set down her shears and listened. I explained enough. The cameras, the secrecy, the thinly veiled concern that had been used as a leash. Her shears stilled. After a long pause, she said softly, "My own son did the same thing once. He said it was for my safety." Her voice carried the kind of knowing that comes from having learned hard lessons. She didn't judge. She only offered the quiet company of someone who understood the hurt. Sitting there in the late light, I felt less alone. I had taken back my locks and my accounts. I had pushed back at the people who treated my life like an amenity. Now, with proof in hand and neighbors who remembered their own betrayals, I was figuring out the next steps, legal, deliberate, and wholly mine. "He told me I might fall and no one would know," Mrs. Calderon said softly, trimming another rose stem. "But the truth? He wasn't worried about me getting hurt. He wanted to see if I was still meeting my bridge friends. He thought they were convincing me to change my will." I stood there stunned. "I changed the locks that very day," she added. "Took down every photo of him in the house. He still sends me birthday cards, but I don't open them." We fell into silence, 2 women holding years of secrets between us, her with garden shears and me with trembling hands. That night, I climbed into the attic and pulled down an old box. Inside was the silver cross necklace Daniel had made for me when he was 9. It was crooked, uneven, a child's effort at love, but sincere. I held it in my palm and cried, not because I still longed for the boy he once was, but because I finally admitted he was gone. The man standing in his place no longer called me Mom with love in his voice. They said they cared. That it was about my health. But it wasn't care. It was control dressed up as concern. The next morning, I moved through my home differently. I didn't flinch when the phone rang. I didn't glance over my shoulder. Instead, I made a list, and at the very top I wrote one word: reclaim. Not just my property, not just my privacy, my life. That afternoon, Mabel sat across from me at the kitchen table, her worn leather briefcase by her feet and determination in her eyes. She had come straight from court, hair pulled back, navy blazer still smelling faintly of strong coffee. "I've seen worse," she said evenly, flipping through the papers I'd gathered, bank statements, receipts, scribbled notes from sleepless nights. But this time, Margaret, they messed with the wrong woman. Mabel wasn't just my attorney. She was also my friend. We had taught Sunday school together before she decided, in her 40s, to chase a law degree. And now she wasn't sitting across the table as just a friend. She was my advocate. We spread the evidence across the table like a map before a battle. The USB drive with Rebecca's voice. We just have to wait. Then the house is ours. The hidden camera footage Ethan had helped me recover. My medical records all clean. No dementia. No decline. Just grief and exhaustion. Something no manual could diagnose away. "They're building a case that you're unfit," Mabel said grimly. tapping the conservatorship forms Daniel and Rebecca had dropped off. That you need a guardian, that you're losing it. I looked down at my hands. These were the same hands that had once steadied Daniel when he took his first steps, that had clapped at his piano recital, that had signed his first college check. And now they wanted the world to believe these same hands were incompetent. I want to fight, I whispered, but I don't want to become someone hardened by revenge. You're not fighting out of spite, Mabel replied, her voice firm. You're fighting for your right to live without being managed like a child. We began organizing everything, files, receipts, calendar notes, witnesses, proof that I wasn't only capable, but clear-eyed enough to recognize betrayal in my own home. Later, while gathering papers in my bedroom, I opened Charles's nightstand drawer. I hadn't touched it since the week he died. The faint scent of his cologne lingered. Cedar, tobacco, warmth. My hand brushed past his glasses, a loose button, and then landed on an envelope. It was sealed. My name written in Charles's steady hand. Would you like me to continue the rewrite and show what was inside Charles's letter? The envelope was heavier than a bill. My fingers hesitated before I slid it open. Inside, on Charles's neat stationery, his hand had written the kind of thing you only read when the world has narrowed to a single sharp corner. If you ever doubt how fierce you are, he had written, remember what pushed you through before. If anyone, especially our children, ever decides to measure your worth by what you can give them, don't let their smallness define you. Choose yourself, even if it means walking alone. I love you. Tears came before I reached the last line. I pressed the paper to my chest, feeling, absurdly, like his warmth might cross the years and settle in my bones. That evening I called Mabel. Let's move, I told her. File everything. Take it to court. She'd already expected it. I knew you would, she said softly. I've begun the forms. By morning the wheels were turning. A hearing date, paperwork, witness lists. Suddenly there was a plan outside the fog of grief. I folded Charles's letter back into its envelope and slipped it beside my pillow. If they think I'm a burden, I whispered to the quiet room, they never saw me to begin with. Then the official seal came, a summons, stamped and precise. Daniel and Rebecca had filed for guardianship. The legal language was clinical, the accusation plain. Claims that I no longer had the capacity to manage my affairs, that my judgment had deteriorated. The words felt like an ice wind. They weren't merely disputing my choices. They were trying to make my life disappear on paper. I didn't break down. Instead, I walked outside and sat on the top step, the court notice folded in my hands until it creased the skin at my thumb. The late sun poured across the street, and for 20 minutes I let the ordinary sounds of the neighborhood fill me. Birds, a distant lawnmower, a car passing. I felt neither weak nor foolish. I felt a dangerous clarity. Their petition called my caution confusion, and my suspicion paranoia. They had turned my vigilance into evidence of decline. I held the pages and felt the theft in the language. Not of property alone, but of dignity, of the right to be the author of my own life. The boy who had once curled up on my lap during thunderstorms, who had announced to his classmates that his mother was a hero, was now using the courts to say, I was gone before I'd left, once. My love was enough, I murmured, the papers folding under my hand. Now they want a password where a hug used to be. I rose slowly, the summons clutched in my fingers, feeling the steadiness return to my legs. My knees ached, but I held myself steady. That was the moment it hit me with a clarity I hadn't let myself face before. They wouldn't stop. Not until I was reduced to a signature on a legal form, deemed incapable, and tucked away where their control was absolute and my existence optional. They wanted me erased, gone, so they could move freely through the wealth Charles and I had built, without the inconvenience of me still standing in the way. but I wasn't going anywhere. Not quietly, not politely, and certainly not under the weight of their lies. I laid the summons flat on my kitchen table, then reached for the phone. It was time to fight. A quiet battle, yes, but one I would carry with every ounce of the woman Charles loved, every part of the mother I had been, and every piece of the woman they thought they could discard. They forgot one thing. I may be older now, but I remember everything. And I was finished being silent. The court date was set for mid-November. Daniel's petition cut deeper than any wound I'd known. It read, "Due to her recent surgery, emotional instability, and memory issues, we respectfully request full guardianship over Mrs. Margaret Ellison to ensure her safety and proper management of her estate." It wasn't just betrayal. It was defamation, delivered by my own son. Mabel, my attorney, wasted no time. She insisted I undergo a comprehensive psychological evaluation with a forensic psychiatrist, not just to protect me, but to build a fortress of truth they couldn't scale. 2 weeks later, I found myself in the waiting room of Dr. Levin's office. The walls were painted sage green. A lavender diffuser sent soft wisps into the air. I kept folding and unfolding a tissue, pressing the edges flat until they tore. When my name was called, I stood tall. I answered her questions with clarity. My finances, my routines, my medications. I recited my grocery list from that morning, even rattled off the name of Bolivia's president just to prove a point. 2 days later, the report arrived. Margaret Ellison demonstrates exceptional cognitive function and psychological resilience. Evaluation reveals no evidence of impairment. Guardianship unnecessary. I read the words aloud to Mabel in the living room. She leaned back, smiling. Let them try. That night I met with my estate planner. For 2 decades, Daniel had been my primary heir. The house, the land, the accounts. Even the vineyard Charles and I had once dreamed of but never spoke about to anyone outside our circle. It was all meant for him. Every holiday I excused their distance as stress. Every birthday I told myself their silence was forgetfulness. But not anymore. I signed the documents that would change everything. Daniel and Rebecca were removed from my will. 60% of my estate was placed into a charitable trust for aging women without families. The remaining portion was divided between the local library, the hospice center, and my dear friend Joan, the one who once paid my utility bill without ever mentioning it. I thought I'd cry when I signed. I didn't. The tears came later, upstairs, when I opened the old memory drawer. There, tucked in the corner, was a small white handkerchief, frayed but neatly stitched with sky blue thread. Daniel. I'd sewn it the week after he was born, tiny ducks embroidered along the edge. I remembered pressing it against his cheek during a fever, watching his little hands clutch it when storms scared him. I sat on the edge of my bed, unfolded it one last time and pressed it to my lips. Inhale, hold, exhale. Then, slowly I folded it again, once, twice, a third time, the same way I used to fold his baby clothes. I placed the handkerchief in a small velvet-lined box, not to throw away or destroy, but to tuck away where memories lived, not futures. Some things we keep, not because they serve us now, but because they remind us of the love we gave and the effort we made. The next morning, I walked into my lawyer's office with steady hands and a clear mind. I signed the final version of my will without hesitation. When the assistant asked if I wanted a certified copy sent to Daniel, I paused before shaking my head. No, I said quietly. Let him learn the way he likes, through paperwork he never expected. Back home, I carried the box up to the attic, the place that once held baby clothes, Christmas ornaments, and forgotten furniture. I set it on the shelf beside my wedding album, whispered, "A mother's heart still carries you, Daniel, but not my estate," and closed the lid. That afternoon, a soft knock came at the door. Ethan, the young banker who had always been kind to me, stood there adjusting his glasses. "I hope I'm not intruding, Mrs. Ellison," he said nervously. "But I've been thinking a lot about what's happening. If this goes to court, I'd like to testify on your behalf." His words trembled, but his eyes were steady. I invited him in and poured him tea. He told me how he had seen Daniel and Rebecca making unusual withdrawals, and how Rebecca once laughed and called me the walking vault. He admitted he'd raised concerns at the bank but was ignored. "You deserve better than this," he said softly. I didn't cry or make a scene. I simply placed my hand gently over his and said, "Most people would have looked away. Thank you for not doing that." His eyes glistened, and for the first time in weeks I didn't feel entirely alone. That weekend, Mrs. Calderon invited me for tea in her backyard garden. I expected a quiet visit, but when I arrived, 6 other women were seated around the wrought iron table, steam rising from their cups. They'd all lived nearby for decades. Neighbors, mothers, friends. Mrs. Calderon smiled. "We call it the League of Unclaimed Mothers," she said with a half laugh, half sigh. The others chuckled too, brittle but real. One by one they shared their stories. Miriam said her daughter had moved across the country, leaving only a voicemail. "You're too much. I can't take care of you anymore." Clara's son had forged her signature for a loan she never knew about. Dolores shook her head and whispered that her daughter married a man who convinced her she was toxic. She hadn't seen her in 7 years. I sat quietly, letting their pain sink into me, until a woman I didn't know well, Gladys, leaned forward. Her eyes were kind but searching. "Can I ask you something, Margaret?" she said carefully. "Are you planning to cut Daniel off completely? Is that what this court fight is really about?" The table went silent. Their faces turned toward me, not in judgment, but with the weight of women who had asked themselves the same question about their own children. Her voice carried decades of maternal conflict, love braided with disappointment, guilt threaded with longing. I didn't answer right away. My heart wrestled with the question just as theirs had. I lifted the teapot and poured more chamomile into my cup. The steam curled up and the honey dissolved with a gentle hiss. I stirred until the spoon sang against the porcelain, then set it down. When I looked up, I gave a small, steady smile, no explanation necessary. Silence can be an answer. As twilight bruised the sky, I sat on the porch and turned Gladys's question over in my mind. "Am I going to cut my son off?" The phrase felt brutal, as if severing a limb. But it wasn't about chopping away love. It was about loosening a rope that had pulled me under for years. Love remained, soft, hidden, like a photograph faded at the edges. But I would no longer let it be an anchor dragging me down. Inside, the house held its history. Crayon drawings taped to the fridge, a dent in the banister from a childhood tumble, birthday cards tucked into drawers. Daniel would always be my son. He simply would not be my default decision-maker any longer, nor the automatic heir to everything I owned. Motherhood does not require martyrdom. Forgiveness does not require erasing the pain done to you. Courtrooms have a peculiar cold, not the shiver of air, but the way memory feels thin and brittle under bright lights. I sat in my navy suit, hands folded, feeling every seam of fabric press me into steadiness. The room was sparse, a clerk, a few quiet observers, the judge behind his bench. Rebecca took the stand first. Her dress was a muted gray. The pearls around her neck were a gift from me once. She dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, the movements practiced. "She's paranoid," Rebecca said, voice breaking on cue. "She won't let us visit. She's isolating herself. We're so worried." She spoke of a change after Charles died, of a woman who had grown suspicious and distant. Her tone was full of sorrow, the kind rehearsed to make the heart ache. For a breath I nearly believed her. Then Daniel rose. He wore the careful composure he used at board meetings, tailored suit, polished cadence. He spoke of the mother who used to bake apple pie and volunteer at the shelter, then lowered his voice and described someone different. Secretive, abrupt, resistant. "Last week she locked her door," he said. "She told me I couldn't come in unless I scheduled through a lawyer." He paused, searching the air for pity. "That's not the mother I love." I kept my hands still. Inside, something wound tight and ready, but outwardly I did not flinch. I met his eyes and listened. The judge's eyes shifted toward me. "Mrs. Ellison, do you wish to respond now, or will you wait for your attorney's motion?" My lawyer leaned close, his voice barely above a whisper. "We can wait. Let them keep talking." I gave a small nod, my hand tightening around the leather strap of my handbag resting at my side. My fingertips brushed the smooth edge of the silver USB drive tucked inside the lining, a sliver of truth hidden in plain sight. The recording was clear. Ethan had made sure of that. The night Rebecca forgot to hang up the phone, Daniel's voice had carried through, casual as ever. "She won't be around much longer. She doesn't need all that money. She barely knows what day it is." Words meant for secrecy, now preserved. I took a measured breath. They didn't know I had it. They thought today was theater, another chance to paint me as a fragile widow, too lost in grief to see clearly. Rebecca spoke again, her voice pitched to just the right register of sorrow. "We've tried everything, Your Honor. We brought her meals. We offered rides to her appointments. But she refuses help. She isn't safe managing such a large estate." She sniffled into her tissue. "We're only here because we love her." That word, love, twisted in the air. A word that should bind, turned into a tool sharp enough to cut. I thought of Charles. If he were still here, he would have stood up and thundered against this betrayal. He would have been furious, not just for me, but for the very idea that his son could do this. Yet I wondered if it was fury that belonged to the present moment, or if these cracks had been there all along, just waiting for the right pressure. The prosecutor shuffled papers. My attorney rested a steadying hand on the table. I glanced across the courtroom. In the back row, a woman with a spiral notebook clutched to her chest sat watching. A reporter, perhaps, or simply someone curious about how far a family could stretch the word duty until it snapped. I straightened my back. They thought of me as fragile, easy to corner. But they had forgotten what time had already taught me, that strength is often silent, forged in decades of endurance. I had lived through nights where the only proof I was still alive was the rhythm of my own breath. Daniel smirked faintly as he returned to his chair, confident in his performance. He didn't know the truth I carried in my bag. He didn't realize today was not about defending myself. It was about letting the mask slip from theirs. When my name was called, the courtroom went still. I rose slowly, not because I was weak, but because purpose demands patience. Each step to the witness stand was deliberate. I adjusted my scarf, the one Charles used to compliment every holiday, and sat without trembling. "Mrs. Ellison," the judge said, "you may begin." I folded my hands, steady. "I know what they want you to believe," I said. "That I've lost my mind, that grief has hollowed me out, that I'm unstable." I let the silence breathe. But the truth is simpler. I am awake. I didn't look at Daniel or Rebecca. I let my words move into the room like slow water. I was the kind of mother who baked extra cookies so my son's teammates never felt left out. I stitched his name into every jacket so it wouldn't be lost. That's who I was. So imagine the moment when the same son tells you that you are nothing more than a financial burden. Rebecca's act faltered. Daniel shifted in his seat. 2 weeks after my husband's funeral, I continued, Rebecca handed me a brochure for assisted living. Not because I needed help, not because I had asked, but because, in her words, it was more practical for their lifestyle. The silence that followed wasn't weakness. It was weight. I let it settle on every corner of the courtroom before I leaned forward just slightly, ready for what was still to come. I finally turned my eyes toward Daniel. "You didn't even read it," I said, my voice steady. "You just handed me a pen." Their lawyer jumped up, objecting that I was trying to stir emotion. The judge shook her head and allowed me to continue. "I cooked Thanksgiving dinner last year. Every dish myself. I roasted the turkey, baked 3 pies from scratch. And Rebecca?" She walked in with a salad and said, "Don't overdo it. You don't bounce back like you used to." A soft laugh rippled somewhere in the room. I didn't join it. "I wasn't here for amusement. I wore a blue dress that day," I continued. "One Charles once said made me look like a young Katharine Hepburn." When I walked down the stairs, Daniel looked at me and said, "Isn't that a little much?" The silence afterward was heavy, unblinking. I let it sit. Then, slowly, I reached into my handbag. Not for the USB drive, that would come later, but for a folded piece of paper. I smoothed it out on the stand. "This," I said quietly, "is a grocery list I found in the trash, 2 days before they staged their little intervention." I held it up. Written by Rebecca. Bullet points. Number 1. Make her feel unsafe living alone. Number 2. List fake symptoms. Confusion, forgetfulness, insomnia. Number 3. Call Dr. Brenner in advance. "Prep him!" Gasps rippled through the courtroom. I didn't look at Daniel or Rebecca. I simply folded the note again and placed it neatly on the table beside me. "They want to paint me as paranoid," I said. "They call me difficult. But the truth is simpler. I stopped being convenient. I'm not angry anymore. I am not even sad. I'm just finished pretending." I drew a slow breath. "I am a mother. I will always love my son. But I am not their asset. I am not a human checkbook. And I will not apologize for protecting what's left of my life." The room held still, waiting. I let the silence breathe before I added softly, "They don't call me Mom. They call me her. In their texts, in their voicemails, in their plans. I'm not a mother. I'm an obstacle, an expense, a problem to solve." Finally, I turned fully to the judge. "I am not unstable. I am not confused. I am not unfit. I am simply unwilling to be used anymore." The silence that followed was thicker than any outburst could have been. The judge leaned back in her chair, unreadable. Rebecca blinked hard, as though she suddenly noticed the walls around her. Daniel clenched his jaw, but his hands shook as he adjusted his tie. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I sat with my scarf neatly folded, my back straight, my truth spoken. For the first time in years, I felt whole. When I stepped down from the witness stand, I didn't look back. The hush in the courtroom was like fog settling on every shoulder. Daniel and Rebecca avoided my eyes as I passed. They gripped each other's hands as if they were the victims. But I didn't walk in shame. I walked in clarity. Within 24 hours, the story reached the news. First, it was a small segment. Widow defends herself in estate battle against her son. But by the next morning, it had spread across television, radio, and social media. People didn't just see a lawsuit. They saw the footage of me, steady, calm, telling the truth without venom. And suddenly, everyone had something to say. Some sided with my son. She's lonely, she's bitter. No wonder they tried to intervene. Families always break apart over money, but others answered back, louder, stronger. She's not bitter. She's brave. If I had to gather proof against my own children just to be heard, I'd be heartbroken too. The battle lines of opinion were drawn, and for the first time in a long time, my story was mine again. It wasn't long before the world gave it a name. The mother who said no, that's what people called me. From there, everything seemed to split into 2 sides. Some said I was cruel, that a real mother should forgive endlessly, that I should let myself be drained like an old well simply because that's what mothers are meant to do. But others understood. They saw what I hoped they would, that this wasn't about vengeance. It was about preservation. It was about setting boundaries. It was about finally living as Margaret Ellison. Not just mom, not just grandma, not just the widow. My friend Mabel fielded the flood of phone calls when the story broke. Reporters, talk shows, podcasts, legal analysts. They all wanted me to sit down and speak on camera. I stayed away from it. I didn't watch the programs. I didn't scroll through the comments. But Mabel did. And what she didn't say, her tightened jaw and wary eyes told me. She started double-checking my locks, driving past my house after dark, keeping watch like a sentry. One morning, her voice shook as she admitted a stranger had called to say I'd burn in hell for what I'd done to my children. I hugged her and told her the truth as I knew it. I hadn't destroyed anything. I had simply refused to keep building a home they were intent on setting aflame. Still, I won't pretend it didn't rattle me. One morning, I found a torn letter shoved beneath my mailbox. It said only "rot alone." No wonder they don't want you. I didn't cry. I folded it in half, slipped it into a drawer, and brewed a pot of chamomile tea. I sat by the window watching the roses sway, sipping quietly. That was when it settled deep in my bones. Some people will always believe mothers owe silence. That we should go to our graves with bitten tongues and dignity buried alongside us. But I wasn't raised to be that kind of woman. And I wasn't about to end my life as one. I wasn't looking for a spotlight. I didn't want to be a martyr or a headline. I just wanted peace. I wanted to stand in my kitchen and not feel guilt woven into the tile. I wanted to tend my garden without hearing Daniel's voice on that cruel voicemail he never meant me to hear. I wanted to wrap myself in my favorite robe and not wonder if I was in the way. I wanted the last pages of my life to be lived quietly, honestly, on my terms. A reporter finally caught me outside the grocery store one morning. She was young, sharp, and already had the camera rolling. "Mrs. Ellison," she asked, "how does it feel to have the entire town talking about you?" I looked her squarely in the eye. "I'm not here to be talked about," I said. "I'm here to be free." She blinked. The cameraman adjusted his lens, but I was already pushing my cart down the next aisle. People mistake noise for strength, but real strength, I've learned, is when you no longer feel the need to explain yourself. That week, I planted hydrangeas in the front yard, blue ones the color of calm. They reminded me of the silence I had spent a lifetime earning. While the world argued about whether I was a villain or a victim, I sat beneath the porch light, writing a letter to no one in particular. It read, "I don't live to be understood. I live to be at peace." And when I found myself once again in the courtroom, the air was so still you could hear the tick of the bailiff's watch. I sat with my back straight, my hands folded gently in my lap. The judge was rereading something, lips moving faintly as his eyes traced the final report. No one breathed. My attorney, Miss Hargrove, glanced at me with a calmness that told me she already knew what was coming. At last, the judge's voice broke the silence. "This court finds that Mrs. Margaret Ellison is of sound mind and fully capable of managing her own estate, assets, and personal affairs." A sharp intake of breath came from my right. The gavel of Daniel's petition had just fallen, denied in its entirety. The judge's words carried further weight. The court notes with concern the evidence of manipulation, financial coercion, and attempted undue influence toward the respondent. While no criminal charges will be filed at this time, all rights and access to the respondent's property and finances by the petitioners are hereby revoked. A ripple of whispers traveled through the courtroom. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw my son slump back into his chair, face flushed, jaw locked tight, his gaze darting as though searching for escape. Beside him, Rebecca let out a jagged sob. Not grief, not love, just disbelief. Her hands shook as they covered her face, her carefully styled hair trembling with her shoulders. She looked like a woman who had lost not family, but a prize. I rose slowly, every movement deliberate. I did not glance at them, not when Daniel muttered through clenched teeth, "This isn't over," nor when Rebecca whispered, "We needed that money." I simply bowed my head to the judge. "Thank you, Your Honor," I said with the steadiness of a woman who had survived storms far greater than this. Then I walked the length of that courtroom aisle, heels tapping softly, past reporters and strangers leaning in to watch. I walked without a smile, without tears, just calm, because I wasn't leaving them behind. I was walking back to myself, back to the woman who had built a life beside Charles, baked cookies for school fundraisers, stretched paychecks to cover bills, sat up through the night with a feverish child, paid mortgages, balanced books, read bedtime stories, held hands through sickness, endured betrayals, and still chose love until love was twisted against her. Love was no longer my weakness. It had become my shield, my line in the sand, my reflection. Outside, the sky hung silver, not stormy, not bright, just honest. A reporter rushed forward, microphone raised. "Mrs. Ellison, how does it feel to win?" I didn't stop. I didn't answer, because this wasn't a victory. It was a release. In the car, my attorney, Miss Hargrove, settled into the driver's seat and looked at me with a proud smile. "You were extraordinary in there." I let out a long breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. "Thank you," I whispered, "for helping me remember I wasn't losing my mind." Her voice was firm. "No, Margaret, you were never losing your mind. You were surrounded by people who needed you to doubt yourself." For the first time in years, a small smile crossed my lips. It wasn't triumphant, just gentle. It didn't linger long. The ache of it all was still there. But it was mine now. My ache, my story, my name. No one else could write it for me. The morning after, I packed a single suitcase. I handed the keys to my lawyer, who would finalize the return of the house fully to my name. I didn't call Daniel. I didn't have to. Soon enough, he would read it in bold print, just as he always wanted everything to be. But I was done living by his terms. I took only what mattered and set aside the rest. Charles had left me enough to start over, and this time, I was starting on my own terms. Not the big inheritance, just a modest trust Charles had arranged years back. It was enough for me to lease a small apartment on the coast. Nothing extravagant, nothing designed to impress, just a quiet one-bedroom where the air smelled faintly of salt and the sunlight fell through sheer curtains in warm stripes. A slim balcony overlooked a patch of lavender that had been left wild by whoever lived there before me. I trimmed it, coaxed it back, and found myself surprised by how much comfort I took in its fragrance. I had once disliked lavender, thought it overpowering. Now it smelled like strength. A reminder that some things bloom even in neglected soil. At a thrift shop down the street, I found an old easel. The clerk told me it had belonged to her sister, who painted until her hands gave out. I paid her asking price and slipped an extra bill into the till before I left. The first time I lifted a brush again, my strokes were shaky and uneven. I had forgotten how to blend, how to let the wrist stay loose. But I didn't mind. I wasn't painting to be good at it. I was painting to let myself breathe. Sometimes I'd only smear a streak of blue across the canvas and stop there. That was enough. A flyer taped to the library door caught my attention one morning. Women's Creative Circle. Thursdays at 10 for ages 60 and up. I almost walked past it. For years, my name had only seemed to exist in relation to someone else. Charles's widow, Daniel's mother, Rebecca's mother-in-law. But the thought tugged at me. The next week, I put on my biggest cardigan, pulled a hat low over my face, and went. They welcomed me like I had always belonged. Ruth brought homemade scones. Elise unpacked her watercolors. Joanne cracked jokes about internet dating that had us laughing until our sides hurt. Over time, we shared more than paints and brushes. We shared the weight of grown children who forgot to call, the ache of losses endured, the relief of second chances, the sweetness of tomatoes ripened in backyard gardens. Some had been abandoned. Some had walked away themselves. But all of us had found ways to survive. In that circle, I wasn't a case file. I wasn't a source of someone else's income. I was simply Margaret, sketching roses from memory. I joined the book club too, though I'd hardly read fiction in years. Sitting with women who debated endings and underlined sentences brought something alive in me. One evening, someone asked me what my favorite quote was. I thought for a long time before answering. I'm not starting over. I'm continuing the life that was paused. The room went still. Then Ruth leaned back and said, That's the truest thing I've heard in a long while. Every now and then, Daniel and Rebecca drift into my thoughts. Not with anger, more with a kind of detached wondering. Do they tell people their side of what happened in court? Does Daniel ever look at himself in the mirror without excuses? Has Rebecca realized I was never her barrier? Only the bridge she refused to cross? I didn't block their numbers, but they never called. And somehow, their silence gave me more freedom than any words could have. On Thursdays, I walked down to the little studio near the pier and set my easel by the window. I paint the horizon, lavender skies, restless waves. I've learned to make purple by balancing red and blue until it looks like twilight bruises fading into calm. The quiet around me doesn't feel empty anymore. It feels like space. Space for air, for healing, for the self I had buried under years of trying to please. I don't miss the big house. I don't miss questioning my worth every time I was asked for something. I don't even miss the sound of being called Mom, only when it meant a demand. Here, surrounded by the scent of lavender and the laughter of women with paint-stained fingers and stories like my own, I finally discovered something no one could try to take away. It was mine. Completely mine, a second life, and this time, it belonged to me. 2 months after settling into the little apartment by the coast, a letter arrived. Not an email or a message on a screen, but a real letter, handwritten in blue ink, sealed carefully, carrying the weight of intention. It was from a nonprofit called Voices Restored. They work to protect elder rights, confront financial exploitation, and offer women a space to heal. One of their board members had followed my case. She wrote that my story had stirred difficult conversations, but, more importantly, it had given people hope. At the end of her letter, she asked, "Would you consider speaking at our national gathering this fall? The theme is inheritance and a mother's quiet voice." I sat with that letter in my lap for what felt like hours. My hands trembled, not from nerves, but from the shock of being seen for who I was. Not a defendant, not a victim, not only someone's mother. A woman who had lived through fire and still stood tall. For a moment, I thought of saying no, retreating into my lavender balcony and my paint-stained afternoons. But then I remembered something a friend in my book club said after we read The Glass Castle. Silence feeds shame, but telling your story breaks it loose. So I said yes. I began writing. Not a polished speech, not a performance, just my truth. I filled pages by hand in the same slow, careful way I had learned to stitch when I was a girl. I didn't rehearse in mirrors. I didn't hire anyone to coach me. I simply wrote the way I breathed, steady, honest, and deliberate. One morning, as I gathered my notes, I opened the old wooden box where I kept mementos. Inside was the handkerchief Charles had given me decades ago, the night we signed our wills. I had embroidered it then with the words, "Everything I am, I give to you." The fabric was worn soft with years, but it had survived moving boxes, hospital nights, and courtroom tears. I set it in my lap and stared at it until the afternoon sun shifted across the room. Finally, I pulled out lavender thread and stitched a new line beneath the old one. And now, I give to myself. When the day of the conference arrived, I chose a navy dress. Not black. I didn't want to carry grief into that room. I wanted to stand as someone who had weathered storms but no longer dripped with sorrow. The ballroom was full. Rows of women, some with walkers, some in bright scarves, others with silver hair and firm voices. A handful of men sat alongside their wives, hands clasped in quiet solidarity. When I walked to the podium, the lights seemed too bright, and my palms dampened. But then I touched the folded handkerchief tucked between my notes. I steadied myself and began. I didn't accuse. I didn't spit anger. I told the story plainly. I spoke of late-night whispers that made me doubt my own mind, of Rebecca's cool disdain, of Daniel's silence that hurt more than shouting. I spoke of rosemary planted in my garden, of nights when I woke at 4 a.m. wondering if I had imagined it all, and then I told them about walking away, not with revenge, but with boundaries strong enough to hold me. At the end, I lifted the handkerchief. I showed them the faded line stitched long ago and the new words beneath it. For a moment the room was utterly still. Then heads began to nod, eyes filled, and hands tightened around tissues. Afterward, an older woman approached me, tears sliding down her cheeks. My son tells me I owe him because I gave up my career to raise him. Tonight, you reminded me I still belong to myself. I embraced her, and neither of us hurried to let go. That evening, back in the quiet of the hotel, I poured myself a small glass of wine. The city lights flickered outside the window like distant stars. I laid the handkerchief on the nightstand beside me. And for the first time in a very long while, I smiled, not because I had beaten anyone, but because I had reclaimed something I hadn't even realized was gone. My own voice. I found a small cafe where the boardwalk dissolved into the sea, the horizon smudged into a single wash of light. It was nothing fancy. Wobbly chairs, coffee that leaned bitter, napkins made from recycled paper, but it felt like something I could claim. I sat by the window with a worn journal I'd begun keeping again. Its pages smelled faintly of dried roses and old ink. My hand trembled a little when I uncapped my pen. It wasn't age alone that made me pause. It was the slow unburdening of years. Across from me sat an empty chair, and I wrote as if a younger version of myself were opposite me. Someone still hoping, still exhausted, still asking permission to be enough. Dear you, I began. I know where you cry. The laundry room. The one place no one follows. I know you fold other people's shirts neater than you fold your own plans. I know you confuse usefulness with being loved, and that you stayed quiet for fear of being called too much. You thought the day they shut you out would be the end. Instead, it was an opening. They had imagined you small, slow, convenient to manage once you stopped producing. They planned for your quiet. You, without even knowing, chose flight. Maybe you crawled. Maybe you sobbed the whole way. But you came here. You found a little apartment where sunlight pours through sheer curtains and lavender leans over the balcony. You met women who carry old hurts like secret luggage, and you laughed with them until your sides ached. You planted things that required no approval. You painted without worrying about critics. You picked up a brush and let blue be blue. If they call you a burden, be light enough to leave. If they say you're too much, remember their cups were always too small. They constructed a future that depended on your absence. You started building one that depended on your presence. When your hands shake in age, let it be from holding a cup of tea, not from fear. Hope isn't magic. It's a choice, quiet and steady, made again and again. I closed the journal. Outside, the ocean inhaled and exhaled, steady as breath. No cameras, no headlines, only the plain truth unfolding. I was not fading. I was coming home to myself. A waitress paused at my table. "Need anything else, ma'am?" she asked. I smiled and said, "Just the check, and maybe one more sunrise tomorrow." She nodded. Before I left, I wrote one last line on the final page, a sentence I'd been repeating under my breath. They planned their future around my absence. I chose to live in my presence. I didn't feel late. I felt exactly where I was meant to be.